All right, so today we're diving into something I think pretty profound and powerful within our Catholic faith. And that's the practice of wearing a small chain.
Okay.
Maybe as a bracelet or an anklet even.
Right.
As a physical reminder
Yeah.
of our holy slavery and total consecration to Mary,
Interesting.
with the goal of being more completely given to Christ.
Okay.
Now, I know that phrase, holy slavery,
Uh-huh.
it can sound a little unusual, right?
Yeah, can definitely raise some eyebrows.
For sure.
Even for those of us who are devout Catholics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're here to unpack today.
Right.
What's the rich spiritual meaning behind this practice within our faith?
Absolutely.
And to really help us understand this, we're going to be drawing primarily on St. Louis de Montfort's writings,
A great source.
specifically his work, The Wearing of Little Chains, from his book, True Devotion to Mary.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be kind of our anchor text for this deep dive.
Perfect.
So our mission today is really to understand
Yeah.
why a devout Catholic like ourselves
Yeah.
might choose to wear such a chain,
Uh-huh.
and what's the profound significance behind it.
I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So let's start with this concept of holy slavery.
Okay.
It can sound a little paradoxical, right?
It definitely can.
We think of slavery as something oppressive.
Yeah, like forced servitude.
Right. But this is something different, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So St. Louis de Montfort really emphasizes this.
Okay.
This is not about literal bondage or chains.
Uh-huh.
It's a voluntary offering of ourselves.
A choice.
Exactly. A free and loving surrender to Jesus through Mary.
I like that, through Mary.
Yeah, it's a key point.
So how does he contrast this with the typical understanding of slavery?
Well, he actually talks about what he calls the shameful chains of the slavery of the devil.
Whoa.
So the bondage that comes from original sin
Okay.
and also our own personal sins and failings.
One of the things that hold us back.
Exactly, the things that weigh us down.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he's saying we're already kind of in chains,
We are, yeah.
but they're the wrong kind of chains.
The chains that keep us from God.
Exactly.
So it's almost like a deliberate exchange there.
Yeah, a beautiful exchange.
Trading those chains for something else.
Yeah, for the chains of love.
For the chains of love. I love that. Okay, so
Yeah.
how does this idea of holy slavery then free us?
So St. Louis de Montfort says, by taking on this glorious slavery of Jesus Christ,
Wow.
we are actually liberated from the grip of sin and the influence of the devil.
It's like a complete reversal.
It is, yeah. It's this powerful idea that true freedom comes from surrendering to God.
So instead of rebelling,
Mm-hmm.
we find freedom in submission.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does he use St. Paul to kind of illustrate this point?
Oh, this is one of my favorite parts.
Okay.
So St. Louis de Montfort reminds us that St. Paul actually gloried in the chains he wore
Right.
for the sake of Christ.
For preaching the gospel.
Exactly. He saw them as a badge of honor,
Interesting.
right? Like, look what I'm willing to endure for my Lord.
So again, those chains take on a different meaning.
They do. They become almost like a symbol of our love and commitment.
And that's a huge shift in perspective.
Yeah, it's really challenging the way the world sees things.
So the world might see chains as something negative.
Yeah, a sign of oppression.
Right.
But for us as devout Catholics, we're seeing them in a totally new light.
In light of our faith.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm curious, how does he connect this idea of holy slavery to the cross?
That's another powerful image he uses.
Okay.
So he reminds us that the cross,
Mm-hmm.
once a symbol of shame and humiliation and defeat,
Yeah,
became the ultimate sign of victory and redemption.
because of Christ.
Right, because of Christ's sacrifice.
Powerful.
And he says these chains of love,
Uh-huh.
for Jesus through Mary, they undergo a similar transformation.
So something that might seem restrictive
Mm-hmm.
actually becomes liberating
It does, yeah. It's all about how we view it.
through the eyes of faith.
Exactly.
Okay, so this whole concept of being bound to Jesus and Mary through these chains of love, it's not like we're forced into it.
Right, at all.
It's got to be something much deeper than that.
It is.
But what's the nature of this bond?
So St. Louis de Montfort really stresses that we're bound not by compulsion or force,
Okay.
like galley slaves,
Right.
but by charity and love,
The love.
exactly as children are to their parents.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image.
And he even quotes the prophet Hosea, right?
He does, yeah.
Where God says, I shall draw them to me by chains of love.
Such a powerful verse.
So these chains are chains of love freely and joyfully accepted.
Exactly. And I think that's key for us to remember.
It changes everything.
It does.
Okay, so how strong does he say these metaphorical chains are?
Oh, this is really interesting.
Okay.
He says, for those who faithfully wear these chains
Mm-hmm.
until the end of their lives,
Okay.
they are as strong as death.
Wow.
And in a way, stronger than death.
Stronger than death. What does he mean by that?
So he's saying that our physical bodies, they'll obviously die and decay, but these chains being made of material substance,
Right.
They won't simply vanish.
They remain.
They do, yeah, even after death.
So that spiritual connection,
Yeah.
symbolized by the chain, endures.
It endures, yeah, beyond this earthly life.
And he even goes a step further, doesn't he?
He does.
With this idea of glorification.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Okay, tell me more.
So there's this belief that on the day of the resurrection,
Uh-huh.
these physical chains, they might even contribute to our glorification.
How so?
He says they might be transformed into chains of light and splendor.
Chains of light. Wow.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful?
It is.
And he ends with this really moving thought.
Okay.
He says, happy then 1,000 times happy
Wow.
are the illustrious slaves of Jesus and Mary, who bear their chains even to the grave.
That's powerful.
It really is.
Give us a lot to think about.
It does.
So let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And delve into some of the specific reasons why St. Louis de Montfort encourages the wearing of these chains, particularly for devout Catholics
Yeah,
who are seeking that deeper relationship with Christ through Mary.
I think that's key.
It is. And the first reason that he highlights is that it's a constant reminder
Okay.
of our baptismal promises and the act of consecration itself.
Right.
So explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so he says that these little chains
Okay.
serve as a tangible external reminder.
A physical reminder
Exact.
of the solemn promises we made at our baptism.
Right.
And what are those promises?
Well, we renounce Satan, we renounce sin, and the desires of the flesh.
Okay.
And we choose to follow Christ.
So it's going back to those foundational promises.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah, those are the basics of our faith.
They are. And for those of us who have made a Marian consecration,
Yeah.
the chain becomes even more significant, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, because it becomes a daily reminder of that intentional renewal of our baptismal vows through Mary's guidance.
So it's like a double reminder.
It is, yeah, it's a powerful reinforcement.
So he's really speaking to our human nature here, isn't he?
He is.
How easily we can forget those promises.
Yeah, and be swayed by the world.
Exactly.
She says we're more influenced by our senses
Right.
than by the unseen realities of faith.
It's so true.
Yeah, and so without a constant external anchor,
Like a chain,
yeah,
we can easily drift.
we can, yeah, and forget those deep commitments we've made.
And he calls these little chains a wonderful aid
He does.
in keeping those promises at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah, keeping them alive in our hearts.
That's beautiful. And he raises a really important point, I think.
Okay.
He asks, why is it that so many Christians,
Yeah.
myself included at times, don't always live in accordance with those baptismal vows?
It's a good question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Why is it that we can so easily fall back into
Yeah.
sinful habits?
Yeah, why do we forget?
Why do we forget? And he points to this lack of a consistent external sign.
He does.
Something like this chain to remind us.
It's like we need that physical reminder.
We're physical beings.
We are.
Okay, so that's the first reason.
Yeah.
The second reason that St. Louis de Montfort gives
Okay.
for wearing these chains is that it's a public declaration,
All right.
even if it's a quiet one, and a rejection of something else.
So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so what is it that we're declaring?
So for us, wearing this chain, even if it's discreetly under our clothes, becomes a way of showing
Okay.
that we're not ashamed to be a servant of Jesus, a slave in that loving sense.
The soul of love.
Exactly. So it's this personal declaration. It might not be something we're shouting from the rooftops, but it's this firm internal stance.
A commitment.
Yeah, and it signifies our rejection
Okay.
of what he calls the deadly bondage of the world of sin and of the devil.
So it's a turning away
It is.
from those things that try to ensnare us.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's not just a personal reminder.
Right.
It's also a statement of where our allegiance lies.
Exactly.
Okay, and the third reason he gives
All right.
is that it's a form of guarantee
Okay.
and spiritual protection.
Interesting.
So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so St. Louis de Montfort says that wearing this chain offers us a kind of spiritual guarantee and protection
Against.
falling back into the slavery of sin and the devil.
Okay, so we're protected.
Yeah.
In a
makes
sense.
sense. Things.
Right. And he says it's an unavoidable choice that we all face.
Okay.
We're going to be bound by some kind of chains.
Okay.
Either the chains of sin and damnation
Right.
or the chains of love and salvation.
Those are our options.
They are. Yeah, he's making it very clear.
Stark choice.
It is. Yeah. And he even quotes Deuteronomy.
Okay.
That powerful verse, choose life.
Choose life, right. Yeah. So he's calling us to actively break the chains of sin.
That bind us.
Exactly.
And to embrace Christ's glorious shackles and chains.
I love that phrase.
It's a beautiful way of putting it.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so he's using the language of chains, but in a completely different way.
In a life-giving way.
Right, in a life-giving way. And he makes this interesting comparison.
Okay.
He says that those who are still trapped in sin...
They're dragged toward judgment by the fetters of their sin.
By those chains.
Yeah.
Okay, but those who are striving for righteousness, they're drawn by these chains of love.
By love, not by fear.
That's a beautiful image.
It is, yeah.
So it's not about being forced. It's about being drawn.
To God.
To God by love.
Yeah.
Okay, so St. Louis de Montfort's writing also gives us some practical examples.
Yeah.
And some historical context for this devotion.
It does.
So I'd love to hear about that.
Okay, so he mentions that these chains have been worn in various ways around the neck, arms, waist, ankles.
Okay, so different parts of the body.
Yeah, and often with specific intentions.
Interesting.
So, for example, some people wore them around their neck as a form of penance.
Okay.
In contrast to jewelry worn for vanity.
So a sign of humility.
Exactly.
Others wore them on their arms.
As a reminder of their slavery to Jesus.
Okay.
Even while they were working.
So a constant reminder.
Right. No matter what they were doing.
And wearing them around the waist.
Yeah.
Was often seen as a hidden act of humility.
It was, yeah, kind of like a secret offering.
Okay.
And then he gives us this really powerful example of Father Vincent Carafa.
Okay, tell me about it.
He was a Jesuit priest.
Okay.
And he actually wore an iron band around his ankles.
Wow.
Yeah. And he even said that he longed to wear a more visible chain.
Really?
Yeah, as a public testament to his devotion.
So that's intense.
It is, yeah. It shows you how seriously he took this idea.
He did. And then we also have the example of Mother Agnes of Jesus.
Yes, another great example. Okay. So she was a Carmelite nun.
Okay.
And she chose to wear a chain around her waist as a constant reminder of her consecration.
I see. So these examples really show us
they do
the different ways this devotion has been lived out.
Yeah, throughout history.
Okay, so it's not just a theoretical concept.
Right.
It's something that people have actually embraced.
In very real and tangible ways.
All right, so the text also touches on some of the intellectual and spiritual currents.
Yeah.
That shaped this idea of holy slavery.
It does.
So talk about that a little.
Okay. So for example, it mentions Caspar Drzbicki.
Okay.
Who was a Jesuit priest.
Okay, another Jesuit.
Yeah, and he developed this devotion known as Mancipium Mariae.
What does that mean?
It means slavery of Mary.
Okay.
And it explicitly involved the wearing of chains as a sign of this spiritual bond with Mary.
Interesting. And then there's also the influence of the French school of spirituality.
Yes, a very influential movement. So figures like Cardinal Pierre de Bérulle and Jean-Jacques Ollier, they really emphasize this concept of holy servitude to Mary as a pathway to union with Christ.
So it wasn't just one person.
Right.
It was this whole movement.
It was, yeah, and it really shaped St. Louis de Montfort's thinking.
Okay, so this practice has deep roots.
It does, yeah.
In the church's tradition.
It's not just some random idea.
It's not, okay, so what are some of the core theological foundations that underpin this whole idea of holy slavery?
So the text highlights two main concepts.
Okay.
First, the imitation of Christ.
Okay.
So St. Paul in Philippians talks about Jesus emptying himself and taking the form of a slave.
Right.
Out of love for us.
So we're called to imitate that.
We are.
That humility, that service.
And so wearing these chains can be seen as a way of imitating Christ's self-offering.
I see.
And then the second concept is the imitation of Mary.
Okay.
So in Luke's gospel, Mary declares herself the handmaid or slave of the Lord.
Right.
Offering her total fiat to God's will.
So she's the ultimate model.
She is, yeah.
Of this loving surrender.
Of saying yes to God.
To God no matter what.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does giving ourselves totally to Mary lead us to a deeper union with Jesus?
So the idea here is that Mary, she becomes this intermediary.
Okay.
She's the one who prepares us.
For Christ.
Exactly.
Okay.
So by entrusting ourselves to her, we allow her to mold us, to purify our intentions, and ultimately to guide us to a closer union with her son.
She's the path.
Yeah, the most direct and safest path.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, so St. Louis de Montfort specifically talked about physical chains, right, like iron chains. But obviously not everyone today is going to be wearing those.
Yeah, maybe not as common.
Right. So how has this practice been adapted in modern times?
So a lot of devout Catholics today who've made a Marian consecration, they'll wear smaller, more discreet symbols.
Like what?
Like a bracelet or a necklace with a Marian medal.
Okay.
Or even a ring.
So it's still a tangible reminder.
It is.
But maybe a little more subtle.
Right. More fitting for our modern context.
Yeah. And the text also reminds us that even though Montfort focused on chains, other sacramentals can serve a similar purpose.
It can. Right, so the scapular, the rosary, these are all powerful reminders.
Of our faith.
Exactly.
And they can prompt us to pause throughout the day, to reflect, and to renew our consecration.
It's all about staying connected to God.
It is. Okay, so what are some of the spiritual benefits and commitments that this practice can encourage in our lives?
So wearing such a sacramental, it can encourage a daily renewal of our consecration.
Okay.
So every time we see it or feel it, it's an invitation to recommit ourselves.
To Jesus through Mary. It can also foster virtues like humility.
It can.
Right.
Yeah, because it reminds us of our dependence on God and Mary's guidance.
And it can also help us with obedience.
It can.
Right.
Because we're striving to align our lives with God's will.
And Mary's the perfect model of that.
She is, yeah.
So it's like having a little spiritual coach on our wrist or around our neck.
I love that.
I love that image. Okay, so the text then highlights a number of saints and holy figures who embraced this practice or this identity of holy slavery.
Let's talk about some of those examples.
Yeah. So we've already mentioned St. Louis de Montfort himself.
Right.
He wore an iron chain.
He did.
And then there's Blessed Bartolo Longo. He didn't necessarily wear a physical chain.
Right.
But he deeply identified with the spirit of Marian consecration.
He did.
He even called himself a slave of Mary.
He did, that's right.
And then we have Father Vincent Carafa and Mother Agnes of Jesus.
Yeah, those powerful examples we talked about earlier.
Right, and they actually wore chains as well.
They did.
And then there's St. Maximilian Kolbe.
One of my favorites.
He might not have worn a physical chain.
That's right.
But he truly embodied that spirit.
He did, yeah.
Of total Marian consecration.
In his life and his death.
And the text also points out that this practice isn't just a thing of the past.
It's not.
Right? It continues today.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Many lay Catholics and religious still embrace this devotion.
In various forms.
Exactly.
Okay, so this chain, or its modern equivalent, can also be a powerful sign of our identity as Catholics consecrated to Mary.
It can.
So talk about that a little bit.
So in today's world, which often emphasizes self-determination, individualism, doing your own thing, wearing this sacramental, even discreetly, it becomes kind of a countercultural act.
How so?
Well, it's a way of saying, I belong to someone.
I belong to Mary.
Exactly.
And to Jesus.
And it's a visible sign of that.
Even if it's hidden.
Even if it's just for ourselves.
Okay.
And St. Paul talks about this.
He does.
In Galatians, he says, I bear on my body the marks of Jesus.
And this chain can be seen as one of those marks.
It can.
So it's like a brand.
In a way, yeah, but a beautiful brand.
Or a mark of love.
Exactly.
And it connects us to other signs of commitment in our life, like wedding rings or the habits worn by religious.
It does.
So they're all visible symbols of deeper covenants.
Of belonging.
Of belonging. And so this sacramental can be a silent witness to our faith.
It can, yeah.
And kind of a spiritual anti-mark.
I like that.
Against worldly values.
Yeah, it's saying we're not defined by those things.
We're defined by something else.
By our love for God and Mary.
Okay, and finally, the text explores this idea of the chain or sacramental as a form of spiritual armor.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
So the Christian life, it's a battle.
It is.
We're constantly fighting against temptation.
Right against the devil.
And this sacramental can be seen as a weapon.
A weapon? Wow.
Yeah, a heaven-ordained weapon.
Interesting.
And Mary is often called the terror of demons.
Right.
So this sacramental being a sign of her protection, it can remind us of that spiritual shield that we have.
Okay.
It's like the blood on the doorposts during Passover.
I see.
A visible sign of God's protection.
So the chain is like a reminder to resist temptation.
Exactly, to stay strong in our faith.
And to rely on Mary's help.
Yeah.
It can also be a way of offering up our sufferings.
It can.
with Christ.
Right, uniting them to his passion.
Through Mary.
Exactly.
So it's like a hidden crown of thorns.
I love that image.
Offered up in love.
Beautiful.
So let's bring it all together.
Okay.
Why might a devout Catholic choose to wear this chain?
Or a similar sacrament.
Or similar sacramental rite.
Yeah, so it serves as a visible and tangible sign of our holy slavery and total consecration to Mary.
Okay.
It's a constant reminder of our baptismal vows.
And their renewal through consecration.
It's a declaration of our faith.
It is.
A rejection of worldly values.
Yeah.
A spiritual safeguard. A mark of our identity.
Right.
And a form of spiritual armor.
It's all of those things.
All of those things. Wow.
Powerful.
It is. And at the heart of it all,
yeah,
it's really about that desire for a deeper union with Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
Through Mary.
Through Mary's loving heart.
So it's a voluntary surrender.
It is.
A slavery born of love.
Not of obligation.
Not of obligation.
Yeah, it's freely chosen.
And that's what makes all the difference.
It does, yeah.
So I think this leaves us with a lot to think about.
It does.
As we go forward in our own spiritual journeys.
Yeah.
How can these tangible reminders help us live out our faith more fully?
Right. What can we do?
Yeah, and how can embracing this posture of humility and loving service,
even symbolized by a simple chain, lead us to true freedom in Christ?
That's the question.
It is. So we encourage you to explore this more deeply.
Yeah.
The richness of Marian consecration and how it can transform your life.
It's a beautiful devotion.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
It was great having you.
Thank you for having me.
Until next time.
See you then.